Empire rise. Systems break. History leaves scars that never fully disappear.
Most people never think about the Strait of Hormuz until a crisis begins. That is understandable. On a map, it looks like a narrow passage between Iran and Oman. Just another strip of water in a region already associated with conflict. But that impression is dangerously misleading. The Strait of Hormuz is not simply a regional maritime route. It is one of the most important choke points in the entire global economy, because an enormous share of the world's traded oil and liquefied natural gas passes through it every day. Reuters reported this week that the strait is a key artery for around a fifth of the world's oil and LNG supply, and that tanker traffic there came to a near standstill after the US-Israel conflict with Iran escalated. That is why Hormuz matters so much. When people hear the word chokepoint, they often imagine a military term, something related only to naval strategy or battlefield control. But in the modern world, a chokepoint is also an economic pressure point. It is a narrow route through which an enormous amount of global dependence is forced to pass. If that route remains safe, trade flows normally and the world barely notices it. But if that route becomes dangerous, blocked, or too expensive to use, the consequences spread far beyond the immediate region. That is exactly what makes Hormuz so dangerous. The strait does not need to be permanently closed to trigger damage. It only needs to become uncertain. Once uncertainty enters the system, tankers hesitate, insurers raise premiums, cargoes are delayed, importers panic, and traders begin to reprice risk across the entire energy market. Reuters reported that hundreds of vessels remained outside Hormuz, unable to reach ports, as traffic effectively collapsed, which shows how quickly a narrow passage can become a global bottleneck. This is the hidden logic of the strait. Its power comes not from its size, but from the scale of dependence concentrated inside it. The global economy has built itself around the assumption that this corridor will remain open, insurable, and usable. Once that assumption broke, the effects moved through oil markets, gas markets, shipping rates, insurance costs, refining margins, and inflation expectations. That is why the Strait of Hormuz is not just a regional story. It is a story about how the modern world hides enormous fragility inside a few narrow routes, and how one maritime corridor can suddenly become more important than speeches, headlines, and even some battlefields.
Behind every great power stands an invisible machine of energy, steel, and movement.
The first reason Hormuz is the world's most dangerous choke point is energy. Modern economies do not simply consume oil and gas. They are built on stable access to them. Oil powers transportation, logistics, aviation, refining, shipping, petrochemicals, and industrial production. Natural gas supports electricity, manufacturing, heating, and critical industrial input. When a route carrying so much of that energy comes under pressure, the effect is not confined to energy traders. It moves into every layer of the global economy. Reuters reported that flows through Hormuz were estimated to be down by roughly 90% at one stage of the current disruption. And Goldman Sachs warned that oil prices could rise above $100 per barrel if flows do not recover. Barclays projected that Brent could climb to $120 if the conflict continues for several weeks. Those are not small moves. They represent the kind of energy shock that can rapidly change inflation forecasts, corporate planning, and consumer costs around the world. This is why the strait matters more than its geography might suggest. A narrow route is usually only dangerous if it carries something the water system cannot quickly replace. Hormuz carries exactly that kind of strategic volume. Reuters graphics showed that the strait handled around 27% of world maritime oil trade in recent years, which means a shock there is not a local inconvenience. It is a stress test for the global energy system, and oil is only part of the story. The gas market is also deeply exposed. Warnings reported that Qatar declared force majeure on LNG shipments, holds its output, and warned that returning to normal production could take weeks to months, even if the conflict ends soon. Qatar supplies about 20% of global liquefied natural gas, and all 10 of the tankers Reuters described were positioned outside Hormuz because of safety risk. Freight rates in both the Atlantic and Pacific LNG markets jumped to multi-year highs, while Asia scrambled for replacement supply. That matters because energy shocks multiply. When crude rises, transportation becomes more expensive. When LNG supply is disrupted, import-dependent countries must bid harder for available cargoes. When refining margins surge, fuel markets tighten further. Reuters reported that Asian refining margins climbed to their highest level in nearly 4 years, as Hormuz disruption forced refineries to cut runs and made crude harder to secure. This is the first great lesson of Hormuz. A choke point becomes globally dangerous when it concentrates energy dependence. The world does not need a total blockade to feel the pain. It only needs enough disruption to make fuel scarcer, transport riskier, and market participants more afraid. That is what turns a maritime corridor into an economic weapon.
Power is not what a nation claims. Power is what its system can keep alive.
The second reason Hormuz is so dangerous is shipping. Globalization often appears strong because goods move constantly, and markets look flexible from a distance. But this flexibility is more fragile than it seems. The system works smoothly only when shipping remains predictable, insurable, and affordable. Once one major quarter becomes too risky, global trade does not collapse all at once. Instead, it begins to seize up piece by piece. Hormuz shows exactly how that process begins. Reuters reported that maritime insurance premiums surged as the Iran conflict widened, while London's marine insurance market expanded the area it considers high risk in the Gulf. Insurers were still willing to offer cover, but at sharply higher cost, which means even before a full closure, the price of moving energy and cargo through the region began rising dramatically. That is more important than many people realize. In modern shipping, physical passage is only one part of the equation. A tanker can technically sail, but if insurance becomes prohibitively expensive, if underwriters reduce capacity, or if owners decide the risk is too high, effective movement slows down anyway. Reuters also reported that global oil and gas shipping costs surged as the conflict intensified, with LNG tanker rates jumping more than 40% in a single move after Qatar halted production. This is why shipping is not just a background detail. Shipping is the circulatory system of globalization. Ports, sea lanes, tankers, and insurance markets do not merely support trade. They make trade possible. When Hormuz becomes unstable, the damage spreads outward through freight costs, delivery schedules, import planning, refinery operations, and financial hedging. And once those pressures start interacting, fear becomes part of the market. Traders begin bidding more aggressively for available supply. Importers start securing cargoes farther away. Companies recalculate transport risk. Investors start pricing in further escalation. Reuters reported that the standstill in Hormuz left hundreds of vessels outside the strait, and that the wider fallout pushed energy shipping costs sharply higher. Those are classic signs that the system is no longer behaving normally. This reveals a brutal truth about the modern economy. Global trade is not as decentralized as people imagine. It depends on a handful of narrow passages that carry an outsized share of value. When one of them fails, the rest of the system is forced to absorb the shock. Sometimes it can, sometimes it cannot. But either way, the costs rise quickly. That is why Hormuz is more than a shipping route. It is a bottleneck through which modern confidence is forced to pass. The third reason Hormuz is the world's most dangerous choke point is timing. If this kind of disruption happened in a calm global environment, the system might absorb the shock more easily. But that is not the world we have. Supply chains have already been stressed by earlier crises. Inflation remains politically sensitive. Trade tensions are still high. Shipping networks have already been tested by rerouting and war risk in multiple regions. In other words, Hormuz is not hitting a fresh system. It is hitting a tired one. That makes every disruption more dangerous. Reuters reported that the current conflict has already become a broader global business shock, not just a Middle East security crisis. Markets have reacted because they understand that Hormuz is not simply a local route. It is one of the hidden support beams of the energy and trade system. When one of those beams starts shaking, businesses far from the battlefield are forced to respond. This is why Hormuz should be understood as a lesson in modern power. For years, many people assumed globalization had reduced the importance of geography. In reality, globalization increased the importance of certain pieces of geography by concentrating more dependence into fewer efficient routes. The more optimized the system became, the more dangerous its bottlenecks became. Hormuz is the clearest proof of that logic. It is not dangerous because it is large. It is dangerous because it is narrow. It is not dangerous because it carries only local trade. It is dangerous because the wider world cannot easily replace what moves through it. It is not dangerous only because of what is happening now. It is dangerous because every major power, every energy importer, and every shipping market knows how much hangs on its stability. That is the hidden meaning of this crisis. The Strait of Hormuz exposes how the modern world really works. Military conflict matters, but infrastructure matters too. Naval force matters, but insurance markets matter too. Diplomacy matters, but so do tanker routes, LNG terminals, refining margins, and the confidence that goods will keep moving. Reuters reporting over the last several days has shown the full chain of stress. Tanker traffic came to a near standstill, oil flows dropped sharply, war risk premiums surged, Qatar halted LNG production and shipments, Asian buyers scrambled for supply, rates jumped, oil price forecasts were revised upward. That is not a normal market fluctuation. That is what a strategic choke point looks like when it starts to fail. History teaches the same lesson again and again. The most dangerous places in the world are not always the biggest countries or the largest battlefields. They are often the narrow passages that carry systems everyone depends on. They are the places where geography, trade, energy, and power collide.
We are not just following events. We are tracing the forces that move them.